They demanded I tear down my grandfather's fence. They fined me thousands for a property line they invented, convinced that a clipboard and a plastic badge gave them the power of God in our subdivision. But they didn't know I spent 30 years drawing the maps they were misreading. If you enjoy watching arrogant tyrants get systematically dismantled by the very laws they tried to weaponize, settle in, you're in the right place. The envelope was taped to the front door. It wasn't mailed, it was hand-delivered. That was the first violation of protocol, but Arthur Penn-Halligan didn't care about protocol yet. He cared about the finish on his mahogany front door, which was currently being marred by cheap Scotch tape. Arthur peeled the envelope off, the adhesive leaving a sticky, stubborn residue on the wood. He sighed, the sound rattling deep in his chest. He was 68 years old, and he had moved to Whispering Oaks to die of boredom, not stress. He adjusted his glasses, slit the envelope open with his thumbnail, and unfolded the letter. It was printed on heavy cream-colored stock with the Whispering Oaks HOA crest embossed in gold foil at the top. It looked more like a royal decree than a neighborhood notice. Notice of violation, third offense. Nature of violation, unauthorized structure, encroachment on common area. Fine assessment, $500, daily accrual pending compliance. Arthur frowned. Third offense, he muttered to the empty foyer. He hadn't received a first or a second. He walked into the kitchen, the linoleum cool under his socks. Through the bay window, he could see the structure in question, a split-rail cedar fence that ran along the southern edge of his property. It was weathered, covered in creeping ivy, and had stood there since the Nixon administration. It was one of the reasons he bought the place. It felt like a border between the sanctuary and the manicured, sterile world of the subdivision. Arthur poured his coffee, black, and watched the street. A silver Lexus SUV was idling at the curb, just slightly blocking his driveway. The window rolled down. Brenda Calloway. Arthur had met her once, briefly, when he moved in 3 months ago. She had offered him a fruit basket that contained more bylaws than apples. She was a woman who wore blazers to walk her dog and treated the neighborhood covenants like the Geneva Convention. She was holding a phone up, filming his house. Arthur set his mug down. He didn't storm out. He didn't throw open the window and scream. That was what amateurs did. Arthur was a man who had spent 40 years interpreting the rigid, unyielding language of municipal zoning laws. He knew that in a war of property rights, the person who loses their temper first loses the case. He walked to the mudroom, put on his loafers, and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp. The Lexus window buzzed down further. Brenda leaned out, her sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. "Did you get the notice, Mr. Penn-Halligan?" she called out. Her voice was bright, chipper, and laced with arsenic. "I found it taped to my door," Arthur said, walking down the driveway steps. "I wasn't aware the HOA employed process servers. We have to ensure delivery when residents possess a history of ignoring correspondence," Brenda said, flashing a tight smile. "That fence, Arthur, it's an eyesore. And worse, it's 5 feet over the property line. You're occupying community land." Arthur stopped at the edge of the pavement. He looked at the fence, then back at Brenda. "That fence has been there since 1974, Brenda. The subdivision wasn't built until '88. It's grandfathered." "Nothing is grandfathered when it steals from the community," Brenda snapped, her smile vanishing. "The board met last night. You have 7 days to remove the structure and sod the area at your expense. If you don't, we'll hire a contractor to do it and bill you, plus the fines." "You want to demolish my fence?" "We want our land back." She tapped the steering wheel. "Read the bylaws, Arthur. Section 4, paragraph C. All non-compliant barriers bordering common areas are subject to immediate removal. You're stealing from your neighbors." Arthur looked at her. He didn't see a neighbor. He saw a variable in an equation that didn't balance. "I'd be careful, Brenda," Arthur said softly. "Is that a threat?" She looked eager, her thumb hovering over her phone screen. "No," Arthur said. "It's professional advice. Before you send a bulldozer onto a man's property, you should be absolutely certain you know where the line is." Brenda laughed. It was a dry, dismissive sound. "We know exactly where the line is. We have the maps." She rolled up the window and drove off, leaving Arthur standing in the driveway. Arthur watched her go. Then he turned and walked back into his garage. He bypassed his car and went to the large locked metal cabinet in the back corner. He dialed the combination and swung the heavy doors open. Inside, resting in padded cases, were the tools of his former trade. A Leica total station, a prism pole, a set of heavy-duty measuring tapes, and on the bottom shelf, a flat file containing the certified county deeds he had pulled the day he made the offer on this house. "You have the maps," Arthur whispered to himself, a cold smile touching his lips. "But I have the math." He pulled out a fresh legal pad. He wrote the date, the time, and the content of the conversation. Then he logged onto his computer to order 4K perimeter security cameras. The war had started. Brenda fired the first shot, but she had no idea she was shooting at a fortified bunker. The silence of Arthur's home was now punctuated by the soft, rhythmic whir of the printer. It was spitting out yet another scanned document, adding to the growing stack neatly aligned on the corner of his oak desk. 2 weeks had passed since the first notice. The fines had escalated with a geometric precision that Arthur almost admired. The initial $500 had metastasized into $3,000. The violations listed were no longer just about the fence. Now they included unsightly vegetation, his prize-winning hydrangeas, improper refuse container placement, his trash can was 2 inches too far left, and aggressive behavior toward board members. Arthur picked up the latest letter. The aggressive behavior citation referenced the morning he had calmly told Brenda to check the maps. In the twisted reality of the Whispering Oaks Homeowners Association, knowing one's rights was an act of aggression. He swiveled his chair toward the dual monitor setup he had installed over the weekend. The screen displayed a grid of 4 live video feeds, crisp and high definition. He had mounted the cameras discreetly under the eaves, not hidden but not obvious to the casual observer. "Showtime," Arthur whispered. On camera 3, which covered the side yard and the disputed fence line, movement flickered. It was Brenda. She wasn't alone. Trailing behind her was a man in a neon yellow vest holding a rolling measuring wheel, the kind landscapers use for rough estimates, not the precision instruments required for legal boundary disputes. Arthur leaned in, adjusting his glasses. He didn't rush to the window. He hit the record button on his console and zoomed in digitally. "Right there," he could hear Brenda saying through the camera's sensitive microphone. "The plot map says the easement starts 10 feet from the curb. Just roll it out to the fence." The man in the vest looked bored. He placed the wheel at the edge of the concrete curb, which Arthur knew had shifted 2 inches during the repaving project in 2015, and began walking toward the cedar fence. The wheel bounced over tufts of grass and a protruding tree root. Arthur shook his head. "Slope terrain," he muttered to the empty room. "No tension correction. Starting from an unstable monument. You're off by 6 inches already." The man stopped at the fence. "It says 15 feet on the wheel, Miss Calloway." Brenda clapped her hands together. "See? I knew it. The deed allows for 10 feet of private frontage. He's 5 feet into the common element. That's community property he's squatting on." She pulled out a can of bright orange spray paint from her oversized tote bag. Arthur's eyes narrowed. On the screen, Brenda shook the can vigorously. She stepped up to Arthur's beloved cedar fence, the wood that had weathered storms since before she was born, and sprayed a thick, jagged orange line down the vertical post. Then she turned and sprayed a large X on the grass inside his yard. "Mark it for the demolition crew," she told the man. "I want this down by Tuesday." Arthur felt a spike of adrenaline, hot and sharp, but he forced it down. This was vandalism. It was trespassing. But more importantly, it was evidence. He waited until they had walked back to the street before he moved. He saved the video file, backing it up to 3 separate cloud drives. He named the file Evidence 004 Criminal Mischief, MP4. He stood up and walked to the kitchen, retrieving a heavy tape measure and a notepad. He went outside, the smell of fresh spray paint stinging his nose. He didn't touch the orange paint. He took a photo of it. Then he looked at the X on his grass. They were getting bold. They truly believed he was just an old man who would fold under the pressure of official-looking paper and orange paint. They thought the expensive suit Brenda wore gave her authority over geometry. Arthur looked toward the street. Brenda's Lexus was gone, But the threat hung heavy in the air. They were going to send a demolition crew. If he physically stopped them, the police would be called, and the narrative would spin out of his control. He needed to stop them before the bulldozers arrived. He went back inside and picked up the phone. He didn't call the HOA. He dialed a number he hadn't used in 5 years. Sterling and Associates, a receptionist answered. "This is Arthur Penhaligon," he said, his voice steady. "Tell Robert I have a land use case, and tell him it involves the Whispering Oaks Charter." There was a pause, and then the receptionist's voice dropped an octave, sounding suddenly more attentive. "Mr. Penhaligon? Robert talks about your deposition in the 98 wetland case all the time. I'll put you through immediately." Arthur held the receiver to his ear and looked at the screen where the orange X was still visible on his lawn. "Hello, Arthur," Robert Sterling's voice boomed a moment later. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Finally deciding to sue the county?" "Smaller target, Robert," Arthur said, "but much nastier. I need you to prepare an injunction. They're threatening a lien, and they just painted my fence." "A lien?" Robert chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. "For a fence dispute? That's aggressive." "They don't know who I am, Robert," Arthur said, watching the sun set over his disputed land. "They think they own the ground. I need you to help me prove that they don't even own their clubhouse." The certified letter arrived 3 days later. It required a signature, and the postman looked apologetic as he handed it over, as if he could sense the malice radiating from the envelope. Arthur took it into his study, sitting amidst the hum of his computer servers. He slit the top carefully. The document inside was thick, stapled at the top corner, and smelled of cheap toner. Notice of intent to file lien and foreclose or foreclose. The header was bold, underlined, and centered. Arthur skipped the legal boilerplate and went straight to the numbers. The total assessment was now $18,550. This included the daily fines for the fence, the cost of the survey Brenda had conducted with the landscaper, legal fees for the HOA's counsel, and a generic administrative burden fee. The last paragraph was the hammer blow. Failure to remit full payment within 30 days will result in the filing of a lien against the property located at 1204 Oak Drive. The association reserves the right to initiate foreclosure proceedings to recover said debts. They weren't just trying to bully him anymore. They were trying to take his house. Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was the primal fear of losing one's shelter, a feeling Brenda undoubtedly counted on to break her victims. But Arthur pushed the fear aside and replaced it with cold, hard logic. A lien required legal standing. Legal standing required proof of ownership. He didn't call Robert Sterling's yet. Lawyers cost money, and Arthur was a man who did his own homework. He grabbed his keys, picked up his leather satchel, and walked out the door. He didn't turn left toward the HOA clubhouse. He turned right toward the highway. 40 minutes later, Arthur walked up the marble steps of the county recorder's office. It was a massive limestone building that smelled of old wax, dust, and history. It was a stark contrast to the vinyl siding and manicured falsehoods of Whispering Oaks. The clerk behind the counter was a young man with tired eyes, surrounded by stacks of bound volumes. "I need to pull the plat maps for District 4, Arthur said, placing his reading glasses on the counter. Specifically the Whispering Oaks subdivision, Phase 1 filings from 1980, and the pre-development surveys for the Miller Farm tract from 1974. The clerk blinked. "That's going to be on microfiche, sir, or in the basement archives. We haven't digitized the pre-1990 overlays yet." "I have time," Arthur said. He spent the next 4 hours in the basement. It was a quiet, dimly lit room filled with rows of metal cabinets. Arthur worked with the methodical patience of a man who had spent his life waiting for the stars to align in a survey scope. He scrolled through reels of grainy film, the light of the viewer casting a pale blue glow on his face. He found the 1908 filing first, the document the HOA was likely using. It showed the subdivision laid out in neat, uniform blocks. There was the common area, a ribbon of green space winding behind the houses, including his own. Then he found the 1974 Miller Farm survey. Arthur overlaid the two mental images. He frowned. He adjusted the focus knob. He pulled a magnifying loupe from his pocket and leaned in until his nose almost touched the screen. "There you are," he whispered. The 1988 developer had been lazy. When they subdivided the farm, they had relied on a monument, a stone marker described in the deed, to establish the property line for the common area. They assumed the marker was at the edge of the creek bed, but the 1974 survey showed the marker was actually 20 feet past the creek bed. Arthur cross-referenced the meets and bounds descriptions. The discrepancy was subtle to a layman, but to a surveyor, it was a screaming siren. The developer had shifted the entire grid on paper to squeeze in an extra lot at the entrance. The HOA thought the common area cut 5 feet into Arthur's yard. In reality, based on the original iron pins referenced in the 1974 deed, which legally superseded the subdivision plat, Arthur's property didn't end at his fence. It extended 15 feet beyond it. But that wasn't the kill shot. The kill shot was what lay on the other side of the subdivision. Arthur frantically scrolled the microfilm to the eastern border of the development. If the grid was shifted 20 feet west, he stopped. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. The community clubhouse, the swimming pool, the pristine, gated pride and joy of Brenda Calloway. According to the original, controlling survey, the pool wasn't just on common ground. The deep end and the pump house were sitting squarely on a plot of land that was never sold to the developer. It was an orphan strip created by the error, and technically, legally, the HOA didn't own the land their headquarters stood on. Arthur hit the print button, the machine whirred, grinding out a high-resolution copy of the map. He printed 5 copies. Then he requested a certified, stamped copy from the clerk for $10. He walked out of the courthouse into the blinding afternoon sun. He held the envelope against his chest like a shield. They wanted to foreclose on him for a fence that was well within his territory. He was going to foreclose on their swimming pool. He got into his truck and dialed Robert Sterling. "Robert," Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed mirth, "do not file the injunction yet. I found something better." "Better than a defense?" Robert asked. "Yes," Arthur said, starting the engine. "I found the nuclear codes." 4:30 a.m. The neighborhood of Whispering Oaks was draped in a heavy gray mist. The streetlights buzzed softly, casting pools of yellow light on the manicured lawns that Brenda Calloway guarded so zealously. Arthur Penhaligon was awake. He had been awake for an hour, calibrating. In his garage, the air smelled of machine oil and ozone. He lifted his Leica TS-16 total station out of its hardshell case. It was a $15,000 instrument, a robotic masterpiece capable of measuring angles to half a second and distances to a millimeter. Beside it lay his prism pole, a heavy sledgehammer, and a Schoenstedt magnetic locator, a yellow wand designed to detect iron buried deep underground. He wasn't dressed in his usual retirement cardigan. He wore his old field vest, stained with the mud of a dozen construction sites, the pockets heavy with plumb bobs, field books, and cans of glow-pink survey paint. He opened the garage door manually to avoid the noise of the motor. The wheels squeaked faintly on the tracks. He loaded the gear into a utility wagon and stepped out into the pre-dawn chill. Arthur didn't start at his fence. A surveyor never starts at the dispute. He starts at the control. He walked 2 blocks north to the HOA intersection of the main county road. According to the 1974 Miller Farm deed, the point of beginning for the entire tract was an iron rod driven into the bedrock near the culvert. He turned on the magnetic locator. The device emitted a low static hum. Arthur swept it back and forth over the overgrown grass near the drainage ditch. Beep. The sound spiked to a high-pitched squeal. Arthur knelt. He pulled a folding shovel from his belt and sliced into the turf. 6 inches down, through layers of compacted soil and road grit, metal glinted. He brushed away the dirt to reveal a rusted rebar top with a yellow plastic cap. He wiped the cap with his thumb. Stamped into the plastic was RLS 142, 1974. "Hello, old friend," Arthur whispered. He set up the tripod over the pin, leveling the instrument with practiced, fluid movements. He wasn't just checking a fence line. He was reconstructing the skeleton of the world beneath their feet. For the next 3 hours, Arthur moved like a ghost through the subdivision. He worked alone, using the robotic tracking of the total station. He shot a traverse line down the center of the main street, moving from one control point to another. The sun began to crest over the horizon, burning off the mist. Joggers started to appear. They glanced at the man in the vest, looking through the lens, but most assumed he was a city worker and ignored him. That was the power of the vest. It made you invisible and authoritative all at once. By 7 a.m., Arthur had worked his way back to his own property. He stood at the edge of his backyard, where Brenda's orange spray paint still scarred his grass. He checked the data collector screen. The math was relentless. It didn't care about feelings or HOA bylaws. According to the vector from the 1974 control point, his rear property corner wasn't where the fence stood. It was exactly where the archive said it was, 18 feet past the fence, deep into what the HOA claimed was common nature trail. He walked into the woods, the magnetic locator singing again. He dug. There it was, the original corner pin, buried under 30 years of leaf litter, completely ignored by the developers who had slapped the subdivision together in the 80s. Arthur drove a fresh stake into the ground beside it. He tied a ribbon of bright pink flagging tape to the top. Then he turned his sights eastward. He moved the total station one last time, setting up on a high point that overlooked the community center. The clubhouse in the glistening blue swimming pool lay below. He aimed the crosshairs at the corner of the pool deck. He fired the laser. The distance flashed on the screen. He rotated the scope to the fence line of the clubhouse. He looked at the coordinates. He looked at the 1974 plat map clamped to his clipboard. The discrepancy was massive. The subdivision's layout had drifted south and west during construction, likely due to a lazy contractor who didn't account for the creek's curvature. The pristine, heated saltwater pool, the crown jewel of Whispering Oaks, was built across a property line. Specifically, the pump house and the entire deep end were sitting on the orphan strip, a piece of land that technically belonged to the heir of the Miller Farm estate, not the HOA. And since the estate had been dissolved decades ago with no claimant for that sliver, it was legally res nullius, or, under adverse possession laws, vulnerable. But the HOA certainly didn't have a deed for it. Arthur took a can of pink paint. He walked to the edge of the pool deck, where a few early risers were swimming laps. A woman in a swim cap stopped and stared at him. "Excuse me, you can't be back here." Arthur ignored her. He looked at his data collector, then at the concrete. He sprayed a precise pink dot on the concrete deck, 5 feet from the water's edge. Then he sprayed a line cutting right through the expensive patio furniture. "What are you doing?" the woman shrieked. "I'm calling Brenda." Arthur capped the paint can. He adjusted his glasses and smiled, a genuine, terrifyingly calm smile. "Please do," Arthur said. "Tell her the surveyor is done, and tell her she's swimming in unceded territory." He packed up his gear. He had the data. The trap was ready to be sprung. The pink spray paint on the pool deck did not wash off. Brenda Calloway had scrubbed it with mineral spirits until her knuckles were raw, but the fluorescent traverse line remained, a stubborn neon scar across her perfect concrete kingdom. She stood in the HOA office the next morning, shaking with a rage that was barely contained by her polyester blouse. The surveyor incident, as the board was calling it, had terrified the lifeguards. But to Brenda, it was the final act of a desperate, senile man. "He's losing his mind," Brenda told the board members gathered around the mahogany conference table. "Vandalism, trespassing. I've already called the police, but they said it's a civil matter because he didn't break anything, just painted it. Can you believe that?" "We should sue him immediately," said Greg, the treasurer, a man who enjoyed counting other people's money a little too much. "No," Brenda said, her eyes narrowing. "Suing takes months. I want him gone now. I want that fence down, and I want a lien on his deed before the end of the quarter." Just then, the office administrator, a timid woman named Sarah, knocked on the door frame. She held a thick envelope in her hand. "This just came by courier, Miss Calloway. It's from Mr. Penhaligon's attorney." The room went silent. Brenda snatched the envelope. She ripped it open, expecting a cease and desist order or a threat of countersuit. She scanned the letter, and slowly the tension in her shoulders dropped. A smile, predatory and triumphant, curled her lips. "Listen to this," she announced, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "To the board of Whispering Oaks, my client, Mr. Penhaligon, acknowledges the receipt of the fines and the survey results provided by your contractor. He is an elderly man with limited resources and finds the current escalation detrimental to his health. He humbly requests a hearing at the upcoming annual general meeting to discuss a settlement regarding the boundary issues and to plead for a waiver of the accrued penalties." Brenda tossed the letter onto the table. "He's folding. He wants to settle?" Greg asked, looking disappointed. "So we don't get the 18 grand? "We get something better," Brenda said, leaning forward. "We get total submission. He wants to do it at the annual general meeting? Perfect. That's next Thursday. Everyone will be there. We'll let him stand up, apologize, and beg for mercy in front of the whole neighborhood. It will be a lesson to anyone else thinking about planting unapproved hedges. Do we accept?" "Absolutely," Brenda said. "Draft the response. Tell him his request for a hearing is granted. Allocate him 15 minutes on the agenda. Put it right after the budget approval so the room is full." 3 streets away, inside the quiet study of 1204 Oak Drive, Arthur Penhaligon sat with Robert Sterling. The speakerphone was on, but the line was dead. They had just hung up after confirming the receipt of the letter. Robert took a sip of scotch. "You realize, Arthur, that letter was technically true, but spiritually it was the biggest lie I've ever drafted. Detrimental to his health? You look like you're 20 years younger." Arthur polished his glasses. "It is detrimental to my health, Robert. Stupidity raises my blood pressure." "They took the bait," Robert said. "They're putting you on the main stage. 7 o'clock p.m. next Thursday, the high school auditorium." "Good," Arthur said. "I need a projector. Does the auditorium have a decent AV system?" "It does, but are you sure you want to do it this way? We could just file the quiet title action and crush them in a judge's chambers. It would be cleaner." Arthur stood up and walked to the window. He looked at his fence, then at the orange X Brenda had sprayed on his grass. He thought about the years of fines, the bullying of young families who couldn't fight back, the arrogant seizure of power by people who thought a title made them kings. "No," Arthur said. "A judge's chamber is private. Justice needs to be seen. They tried to humiliate me in front of my neighbors, Robert. I'm simply returning the favor. I don't just want to win the case. I want to dismantle the mechanism that allowed them to think they could do this." He turned back to the lawyer. "Prepare the slide deck, scan the 1974 survey, and scan the photos of the pool encroachment. I want the resolution high enough that the people in the back row can see exactly where the property line cuts through Brenda's favorite lounge chair." "It's going to be a bloodbath," Robert noted dryly. "No," Arthur corrected him. "It's going to be a geography lesson." The flyers were stapled to every telephone pole in the subdivision. They were bright, aggressive canary yellow. "Annual HOA meeting, budget vote and compliance hearing agenda. Item 4, remediation of property violations." It's Penhaligon case. Brenda had practically marketed the event as a public execution. She wanted a full house. She wanted witnesses. In her mind, this wasn't just about offense. It was about reasserting dominance over a neighborhood that had begun to whisper about her overreach. Inside Arthur's study, the mood was different. It was the quiet, focused intensity of a submarine crew rigging for silent running. Robert Sterling sat at the desk, his laptop connected to Arthur's large monitor. "Go back to slide 4, Arthur said, leaning over the lawyer's shoulder. Robert tapped a key. The screen displayed a digital scan of the 1988 subdivision map, the one the HOA used. It showed the straight, orderly lines of the property boundaries, with Arthur's lot clearly marked. "Now overlay the 1974 Miller survey," Arthur commanded. Robert pressed another key. A translucent red layer faded into view over the black lines. The shift was visceral. It was like watching a bone break and reset in the wrong position. The red lines, the true legal boundaries, were shifted significantly to the south and east. "Perfect," Arthur said. "Pause there. Zoom in on the community center." The image zoomed. The red line of the original property boundary sliced effortlessly through the deep end of the community pool and bisected the pump house. "It's undeniable," Robert said, admiring the devastation. Usually in these cases, we're arguing over inches. A fence post here, a gutter overhang there. This is gross negligence by the original developers. They built the amenities on land they didn't own. And land they don't pay taxes on, Arthur added. I checked the assessor's website. That strip is still listed as undeveloped agricultural residual under the defunct Miller estate. The HOA has been squatting on it for 30 years. Robert closed the laptop. The strategy remains the same. Let Brenda speak first. Let her lay out her case. Let her state, on the record, that the HOA's maps are infallible and that strict adherence to the boundaries is the highest law of the neighborhood. We need her to commit to the absolute authority of the survey lines. She won't be able to resist, Arthur said. The days leading up to Thursday moved with agonizing slowness. Arthur saw neighbors glancing at his house as they walked their dogs. Some looked sympathetic, knowing they could be next. Others, the ones in Brenda's inner circle, looked smug. On the evening of the meeting, Arthur dressed with care. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a clean, pressed, button-down shirt and a tweed jacket. He wanted to look like exactly what he was. A retired professional, a grandfather, a reasonable man pushed too far. Robert Sterling met him in the driveway. The lawyer was carrying a slim briefcase and a portable projector. "Ready?" Robert asked. "I've been ready since she painted my grass," Arthur replied. They drove to the local high school auditorium in silence. The parking lot was full. Brenda had done her job well. The turnout was record-breaking. As they walked through the double doors, the smell of floor wax and stale popcorn hit them. The auditorium was buzzing with low conversation. At the front of the room on a raised stage sat the HOA board. They were arranged behind a long table draped in blue cloth. In the center sat Brenda. She was wearing a red blazer that looked like armor. She was laughing with the secretary, looking out over the crowd like a monarch surveying her subjects. When Arthur entered, the room went quiet. The silence rippled from the back rows to the front. Heads turned. Arthur kept his chin up. He walked down the center aisle, his steps echoing on the linoleum. He didn't look at the neighbors. He kept his eyes locked on Brenda. She saw him approach and stopped laughing. She tapped the microphone, the feedback squeal cutting through the tension. "Mr. Penhaligon," Brenda's voice boomed through the speakers. "So glad you decided to show up. We have a seat reserved for you." She pointed to a small, lone chair positioned in front of the stage, facing the board. It was the accused chair. Arthur ignored it. He walked to the front row of the audience seating and sat down next to Robert. "We'll sit here until our agenda item comes up," Arthur said, his voice calm enough to carry to the stage without a microphone. Brenda's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly. "Suit yourself. Just don't get too comfortable. We have a lot to get through before we address your situation." She banged the gavel. "I called this meeting to order." Arthur crossed his legs and settled in. He watched Brenda open her folder. He watched the board members nod sycophantically. They had no idea that the two men in the front row weren't there to surrender. They were there to deliver the eviction notice. The first 40 minutes of the meeting were an exercise in bureaucratic boredom. The treasurer droned on about the rising cost of mulch, and the secretary read the minutes from the previous session in a monotone buzz. Brenda Calloway sat center stage, impatient. She tapped her pen against the microphone base, her eyes frequently darting to Arthur in the front row. She was saving the best for last. Finally, the agenda shifted. "Item 4, Brenda announced, her voice sharpening. "Remediation of property violations at 1204 Oak Drive." She clasped her hands. "As you all know, we value our community standards. They protect our property values. Unfortunately, Mr. Penhaligon has chosen to ignore multiple warnings regarding a non-compliant fence that encroaches significantly onto Common Area B." She motioned to the screen behind her, where a blurry photo of Arthur's fence was, displayed with a crude red arrow pointing to it. "The board moves to finalize the fine assessment of $18,000 and initiate a lien on the property to cover the cost of demolition," Brenda said. She looked down at Arthur with a benevolent, pitying smile. "Mr. Penhaligon, you requested time to speak. I assume you're here to propose a payment plan?" Arthur stood up. He buttoned his jacket. Not exactly, Ms. Calloway. He turned to the audience, then back to the board. I requested time to clarify the issue of encroachment. You have stated repeatedly that building on land you do not own is theft. Is that the board's official position? It is, Brenda snapped. Zero tolerance. If you build over the line, you tear it down. No exceptions. And you rely entirely on the subdivision maps to determine these lines? Of course we do. They are the law. Arthur nodded to Robert Sterling. Then let's look at the law. Robert stood and plugged an HDMI cable into the podium's port. The screen flickered and the blurry photo of the fence vanished, replaced by a crisp, high-definition scan of a yellowed document. This, Arthur said, his voice projecting clearly without a microphone, is the original Miller Farm deed and survey from 1974. It establishes the foundational control points for this entire valley. Brenda rolled her eyes. Mr. Penhaligon, we are not here for a history lesson. We use the 1908 filing, which is legally subordinate to the original markers, Robert interjected smoothly. If you'll just watch the screen. Robert clicked a remote. A bright red grid superimposed itself over the black and white map. The developer made a mistake in 1908, Arthur explained, walking toward the screen. He used a laser pointer, the red dot steady in his hand. They started their survey from a displaced monument. They shifted the entire grid 20 feet to the west and 12 feet to the south. So what? Greg the treasurer shouted. Maps get updated. Property rights do not, Arthur replied. Because of this shift, my fence is not 5 feet onto HOA land. The HOA land actually begins 15 feet past my fence. The room murmured. Brenda stood up. This is ridiculous. You can't just draw lines on a screen and I didn't draw them, Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming hard as stone. A licensed surveyor did, and verified them with the original iron pins found buried on site. Robert, next slide. The image changed. It was an aerial drone shot of the community center, overlaid with the red survey lines. The gasps were audible. The red line, the true property boundary of the original farm tract, didn't just graze the HOA amenities. It sliced right through them. Arthur pointed the laser at the shimmering blue rectangle of the community pool. This is the orphan strip, Arthur said. Land that was never conveyed to the developer because of the error. It technically belongs to the Miller estate heirs, or, via adversum, possession claims, potentially to the adjacent lot owner. He pointed the laser at the pump house in the deep end of the pool. Ms. Calloway, you demanded strict adherence to boundaries. You stated that any structure encroaching on land not owned by the builder must be demolished. Zero tolerance. Arthur turned to face Brenda. Her face had gone the color of parchment. She was staring at the screen, her mouth slightly open, the gavel limp in her hand. By your own definition, Arthur said, the community pool is an illegal structure. The pump house is a trespass, and the clubhouse patio is built on land the HOA does not own. You can't, Brenda stammered. The arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the sheer, crushing weight of liability. I have already filed a quiet title action to clarify the boundaries, Arthur said, addressing the stunned audience. If the board proceeds with the lien on my home, I will be forced to enforce the boundary lines on the southern end, which means the pool will have to be cut in half. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. However, Arthur continued, I am a reasonable man. I don't want to ruin the summer for the neighborhood children. I just want to be left alone. The room erupted. It wasn't anger at Arthur. It was panic directed at the stage. Is this true? A man in the back shouted. Do we not own the pool? How much is this going to cost us to fix? A woman screamed. Brenda pounded the gavel, but it sounded weak, like a child banging a toy. Order, order! I think the time for order has passed, Brenda, Arthur said calmly. I think it's time for a resignation. He sat down. The slide remained up on the screen, the red line glowing like a neon judgment, burning Brenda's reign to the ground. The coup was swift, brutal, and completely democratic. By the time the sun rose on Friday morning, the Whispering Oaks Homeowners Association was effectively decapitated. The chaos at the high school auditorium had not ended with a gavel bang, but with a shouting match that nearly required police intervention. The residents, realizing their property values were tied to a swimming pool that sat on illegal land, had turned on Brenda Calloway with the ferocity of a starving pack. A motion of no confidence was drafted on a napkin, circulated through the crowd, and signed by 82% of the homeowners present. But for Arthur Penhaligon, the emotional victory was secondary. He was interested in the paper victory. 1 week later, Arthur sat in the conference room of a downtown law firm. Across the table sat the HOA's legal counsel, not the cheap retainer lawyer they usually use to bully residents over trash cans, but a serious litigator hired for damage control. Next to him sat the interim board president, a nervous man named David who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Brenda was not there. She had resigned via email at 3:00 a.m. the night of the meeting, citing health reasons. Rumor had it she was already looking for a realtor to sell her house. "Let's review the terms," Robert Sterling said, sliding a thick document across the polished mahogany table. He didn't smile. He looked like a shark smelling blood in the water. The HOA lawyer picked up the document. "Mr. Penhaligon, we acknowledge the survey error. It is unfortunate. We are prepared to wipe the fines and the lien on your client's property immediately." "That's the appetizer," Robert said, leaning back. "Let's talk about the main course, the pool." The interim president flinched. "Please, Mr. Penhaligon, if we have to tear up the pool deck and move the pump house, the special assessment on the residents will be astronomical. It will bankrupt the reserve fund." Arthur adjusted his glasses. He looked at David, seeing the genuine fear in the man's eyes. Arthur wasn't a monster. He was just a man who liked clear lines. "I have no interest in bankrupting my neighbors, David," Arthur said softly. "I live there too." "Then what do you want?" "I want peace," Arthur said, "and I want permanence." Robert tapped the document. "My client is willing to grant the HOA a perpetual easement for the encroaching portions of the pool and clubhouse. This legalizes the structure's existence on his land without transferring ownership. The land remains his. The right to use it is yours." The HOA lawyer let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. "That is very generous. In exchange for—" "In exchange for a binding covenant," Arthur listed, counting on his fingers. "1, the fines are rescinded with prejudice. 2, Mr. Penhaligon's existing fence is declared permanently compliant, regardless of future board changes. 3, the HOA reimburses Mr. Penhaligon for the independent survey and all legal fees incurred, totaling $26,000. Arthur paused. "And 4, a written apology signed by the former president to be published in the next community newsletter." The HOA lawyer grimaced at the last one but nodded. "We can make that happen." "Good," Arthur said. He pulled a pen from his pocket, a heavy brass fountain pen. He signed the agreement with a steady hand. 6 months later, the autumn leaves were turning gold in Whispering Oaks. The air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke. Arthur sat on his back porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. The cedar fence was still there, weathered and strong. The orange spray paint had long since grown out and been mowed away, leaving the grass pristine. Across the fence in the common area, a new sign had been erected near the pool. It didn't list rules about running or diving. It was a small bronze plaque that Robert Sterling had insisted on as part of the easement recording. "Property line surveyed by A. Penhaligon. Easement granted courtesy of the owner." It was a subtle flex, a permanent reminder etched in metal that the community's playground existed only because Arthur allowed it to. A car drove slowly down the street. It was a moving truck. Brenda Calloway's house had finally sold for slightly under asking price. Arthur took a sip of his coffee. He watched a cardinal land on his fence post. No one came to measure his grass. No one taped notes to his door. The neighborhood was quiet, ordered, and respectful of the lines drawn in the earth. He had spent his life measuring the world, defining where one thing ended and another began. They had tried to blur those lines, to steal the space that was his. They thought power came from a title. Arthur knew the truth. Power came from the map. And the man who holds the map holds the world. Arthur smiled, closed his eyes, and listened to the wind in the trees. It was the sweetest sound of all. Silence.